Today I'll be talking about photography at the London Zoo from the 19th and early 20th centuries. Scholars often use photographs to complement their work, but I found that very often there's not much written about the photographs and photographers themselves. For the sake of time, I'll just be going through a handful of the earliest photographers who worked at the zoo. But before getting into that, I'd like to provide some context for the kind of culture of support for artists working in traditional media at the zoo, which Anne also mentioned. The zoo was really an important site of artistic production at the time. So for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the genre of animal painting was popular among the general public in Britain, but which is evidenced by the success of figures like George Stubbs and James Ward. But the artistic elite largely viewed it as inferior to other genres of painting. And animal subjects seemed to have been excluded from the curricula of training programs like those at the Royal Academy. As such, students wishing to include animals in their work would have had to look elsewhere. And for exotic species, artists in training would have had to look at private menageries for examples. And prior to the zoo, probably the best resource in London, at least, would have been the Exeter Change Menagerie on the Strand. And that predicament I just described is exactly what a young Edwin Landseer faced when he was in training at the Royal Academy in his teens. If you're not familiar with Landseer, he's probably most famous for the monumental lions at Trafalgar Square. And during his teens, he's said to have split his time between classes at the Royal Academy and extracurricular study at the Exeter Change. On the slide, you can see some drawings that are attributed to him from this time. But once the Exeter Change Menagerie was dissolved, the zoo became the clear choice for artists wishing to study animals. And we're able to piece together the logistics of that practice from archival documents here in the ZSL Library and Archive. So artists wishing to study at the zoo could submit a request to the secretary, at which point they would be sent a free admission card or artist ticket at no cost. This allowed them to enter the zoo for free between the hours of 9 and 3 o'clock, except on Sundays, which were reserved for fellows. And these tickets are usually valid for 12 months, at which point they could be renewed with another letter to the secretary. And those rules would eventually apply to photographers as well. So the first known photographs to emerge from the London Zoo were taken between 1850 and 1852 by Don Juan Carlos Maria Isidro de Borbon, the Comte de Montizon. Upon completion, the series of 43 images was exhibited and eventually purchased by Queen Victoria. Montizon showcases dozens of species in his photos, but the image on the screen of Obèche the hippo is probably his most well-known photograph. Just as a quick aside, I'd like to quickly look at the limitations of photography at this time. So the image on the screen really exemplifies that. At first glance, it looks like just a standard wildlife photograph, but in reality, it's completely staged. The photographer has placed a taxidermy heron in the pond for the sake of the photo. The long exposure times of orthodox photographic methods would have made it very impractical to photograph living animals at this time. This in particular supposedly took 20 minutes to expose. That's definitely longer than the norm, but I think it gives a sense of kind of the spectrum of exposure times. And I'll get into how Montizon was able to photograph zoo animals in a moment, but just keep in mind how revolutionary his work would have been at the time. The image on the screen is, I think, one of his most technically impressive photographs. He's managed to capture the pelican's damp, ruffled feathers, all of which are very distinctly rendered, and the plumage stands in stark contrast to the underexposed, non-focused background. Not all the photos present such an unobstructed view of the animal, though. In this photograph of the male lion, subject is depicted laying on the concrete slab of his enclosure, staring lazily out at the viewer. Montizon puts us at eye level with the lion, and the soft lighting and close vantage point result in an intimate portrait that really forces the viewer to contemplate his captivity. At this point, lions are housed in the carnivore terrace alongside bears, hyenas, and other big cat species. They were each in their own cramped cage in a row. And it's difficult not to draw comparisons to the living conditions in establishments like the Exeter Change Menagerie. As I mentioned a little bit ago, when looking at these images, it's important to keep in mind the technical limitations that Montizon was contending with. Wet plate photography is extremely laborious, and there certainly would have been many days where he walked away with nothing but unusable negatives. He was able to produce such high-quality images, though, in part because of his pioneering experimentation with the wet collodion process. Collodion is one of the chemicals used in preparing glass plates prior to exposure. Montizon developed his own recipe for collodion, which was more sensitive than the pre-made versions available for purchase at the time. This allowed him to cut exposure times down to about 2 seconds. Although Queen Victoria did eventually purchase them, the ZSL itself did not express much interest in Montizon's photographs. Institutional leadership at the time clearly preferred artists like Edward Lear and Joseph Wolfe, who worked in traditional media like painting and drawing. It wasn't until 1864, a decade after Montizon's photos were widely exhibited, that other photographers began directing their attention towards the zoo. One of the most prolific of whom was Frank Hayes. Hayes was a frequent contributor to contemporary periodicals in which he describes his experience at the zoo. And these include technical information like chemical ratios of developing fluid, and also short anecdotes that offer a behind-the-scenes look at his photos. Hayes received assistance from zoo staff, including the superintendent at the time, Abraham D. Bartlett. Bartlett and the keepers at the zoo were quite accommodating of photographers and willing to assist in wrangling the animals. So while there might not have been much in the way of official institutional support for photography at the time, it seems employees involved in the day-to-day operations took an informal interest in photographers and their work. Hayes was clearly aware of the technical challenges that he would need to overcome, but this led him to overcorrect for some of these issues. So he was able to reduce exposure times to about 1/3 of a second. This lowered the risk of capturing motion blur, but the trade-off was that many of the photos come out very overexposed. So in this one, the sky and the ground wash out, almost completely wash out the camel subject. And even though the camel's in focus, the background really distracts from the intended subject. Even so, with 1/3 of a second was not always quick enough to avoid motion blur. So here you can see some people clearly walked into the frame right at the moment of exposure. And I think Hayes' frustration in photographing certain animals is kind of comes across in the final images. Being quite shy animals, the porcupines were reluctant to leave the privacy of the indoor portion of their enclosure. To remedy this, Hayes writes that the keeper, quote, armed with a stiff broom, entered their house and drove them out, and whenever the fine specimen of the crested porcupine tried to go in, the broom was pushed in his face. To this treatment he decidedly objected, and we thus got all his quills erected, and while standing perplexed for a second, he gave me a chance which succeeded, end quote. And again, this one is very overexposed, and the porcupine's quills are almost completely lost in the brightness of the human silhouettes in the background. In this image of a cashmere shawl goat, an attendant or zookeeper's hand juts into the frame on the left side of the picture plane, and it looks like he's snapping, trying to get the goat's attention or encourage it to move. And again, you can see it's very overexposed, and the focus is not particularly sharp either. Hayes mounted these photos as stereo cards and sold them through his studio for $1 and 6 each, a price point that probably would have alienated many potential buyers, as it would have been cheaper just to visit the zoo at the time. Following Hayes, Frederick York began photographing animals at the zoo in 1869, embarking on a series of over 200 images, which was the most comprehensive photographic survey of the zoo at that point. Compositionally, they share a lot of overlap with the work of Hayes. The animal subjects are usually depicted in profile, with no attempt to avoid fencing or iron bars of the enclosures, in most cases. As a result, I think many of the images come across as kind of sterile, as if the photographer is just checking names off a list with each new species. York was actually involved in significant technological innovation during his time, though. In 1873, he debuted a new custom camera, which he had fabricated specifically for the purposes of zoo photography. Instead of just two side-by-side lenses of a standard stereoscopic camera, York's camera had a third lens, which could be used to compose images, which acted as kind of a proto-viewfinder. According to the Optical Magic Lantern Journal, this was the first camera to be fitted with a finder. This design allowed York to stay underneath a focusing cloth for the entire process, so as to avoid drawing the animal's attention. From the late 1870s onward, the photographs produced at the zoo tended to be more dynamic, and one of the first to engage with this new style was Thomas James Dixon, who started in 1879. 3 years earlier, work had been completed on the zoo's new big cat enclosure. The new lion house was much larger than the carnivore terrace, and the large outdoor cages made for much more interesting photographs. Dixon presents close-up, intimate views of the animals. His subject is in sharp focus against the soft blurring of the background, an indication of his use of long lenses. And those long lenses also imbue the images with a greater sense of intimacy. Like Hayes, Dixon enlisted help from keepers, having them speak to lions from different positions off camera to coax a more interesting pose out of them. And this is just another example. Some of his photos also show attempts at darkroom editing, which is new for zoo photography. A notable example is on the screen. So on the left here you can see he's scratching something out of the background. And then beneath the lion's tail you can see he wrote his name and presumably a date or a number and then scratched it out. Dixon didn't really release much commentary on his work, so it's difficult to know his thought process behind edits like that. And finally, another major figure was during the late 19th and early 20th centuries was Gambier Bolton. He was described in one contemporary source as the Edwin Landseer of photography, and he was well known even outside of Britain during his lifetime for his zoo photographs. This is one of his most arresting images. It's titled Majesty. Bolton captures a moment in which the lion turns towards the camera, locking eyes with the viewer. The point of focus is on the lion's face, and the rest of the image is slightly blurred. and the soft textures are reminiscent of Montezon's lion portrait from nearly half a century earlier. Like Frederick York, Bolton also designed a specialty camera specifically for taking pictures of animals, and it included a lot of features to make it conducive to that. He also designed his London studio for photographing small animals like birds and monkeys. The space had plenty of natural light with props like branches and tables to pose the animals. It's not entirely clear how he sourced the animals. If they were part of the London Zoo collection, that would speak to the degree of access he had, and he was a fellow of the society. But it's also possible that they were just owned by other private collectors he knew. I don't have any evidence that this echidna was photographed in the home studio, but I think it's certainly possible. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the zoo started to fully embrace photography. Wood engraving reproductions from photos had been used in publications like Proceedings and Transactions before, but at an institutional level, the ZSL did not have much meaningful engagement with the medium in the 19th century. Once Peter Chalmers Mitchell became secretary, though, new editions of the illustrated guide were published with photographic illustrations, some of which you can see on the screen. Previous editions published under Sclater had recycled kind of low-quality woodcut prints of animals from year to year, so this is a big improvement. This initial batch of photos were taken by the first official zoo photographer, W.P. Dando. And you can see a couple more examples on the screen from that first illustrated guide with photographs. Eventually others like F.W. Bond, Henry Irving, David Seth Smith, and many others would contribute photos to the illustrated guide, but I just don't have time to get into them today. Postcards also became ubiquitous during this time. Individuals like Hayes had been selling photographic souvenirs for decades, but the zoo only officially started selling them in 1904. On the screen is an example from one of those first runs of postcards. Here's some more from a little bit later. The zoo's support for photography would only increase in the years to follow. Celluloid film and cameras eventually started being sold at a photographic kiosk that Gambier Bolton had championed, alongside postcards and the illustrated guide. And a permanent darkroom would eventually be installed on the grounds as well. Some more examples. Just to wrap up, I didn't have time to get into it, but in my research I hypothesized that once the ZSL did start to embrace photography, it kind of took advantage of the general public's naivete about the medium to obscure failures in animal husbandry. So I'll just plug my forthcoming article coming out in Antennae, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture this November, where I used the zoo's decades-long problem of rickety lion cubs as a case study in examining that. Thank you.